Hello, everybody. I'm Ainsley Newson, and I'm a Professor of Bioethics at the University of Sydney, and I'm here on Gadigal land. This is unceded Aboriginal land. It's a beautiful spring day here, and I feel very grateful to have that experience of this beautiful weather. And there, I would like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and I'd also like to particularly acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be watching this seminar or listening in live today. So today is our 6th seminar for the Australian ELSI Genomics Network, and this network is supported by the Australian Genomics Health Alliance, Australian Genomics, and I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Kitty Jean Laginha for her help in putting this seminar together. Today we're going to talk about a project that has recently concluded called the A-GLIMMER project. And this project looked at a few different elements to do with insurance discrimination for genetic and genomic testing in Australia, in particular the moratorium that is in place and whether that is effective. We have Jane Tiller, Dr. Jane Tiller from Monash University, and Professor Martin Delatycki from BCGS and the University of Melbourne. Jane is going to give a formal presentation, which she has pre-recorded because Jane literally stepped off a plane from a long-haul flight very recently ago, much more recently than she planned, actually. And Martin is going to give a short commentary or some points from his perspective as a clinical geneticist and researcher in translational research projects about genomics. I'll just give a quick formal bio for both Jane and Martin as well. So Jane wears many hats and does many things. She is a lawyer, a genetic counsellor, and a public health researcher, and her work addresses ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics. Jane is a founding member of the Australian Genetic Non-Discrimination Working Group, which I'll add has done a huge amount of work for reform in Australia in this space. She's also ethical, legal and social advisor in public health genomics at Monash University and a senior project coordinator with Australian Genomics. And Professor Martin Delatycki will be known to almost all of you, I would think, and he is a clinical geneticist at the Victorian Clinical Genetics Services and co-director of the Bruce Lefroy Centre at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. Martin has clinical and research interests in neurogenetics and genetic screening. Most recently, the Mackenzie's Mission project looking at reproductive genetic carrier screening in Australia. And he has a long-standing interest in ethical issues in clinical genetics, lots of publications in that area, I might add, and including a specific interest in genetic testing and insurance. And both Jane and Martin were investigators and senior investigators in the A-GLIMMER project. So as I noted, Jane has just stepped off a plane, and so we planned for this, and Jane pre-recorded her talk. And so as a result, I will now share screen to provide Jane's talk, and then we'll have Martin's commentary and Q&A afterwards.
Hello all, and thanks for coming to be part of this. I'm really excited to be talking about the work that we've been doing and the progress that we've been making. I'm actually coming to you right now from Philadelphia. Unfortunately, my flight was changed since when we made these original plans, but don't worry, I'm only a day ahead, and so you'll get all of the up-to-date progress and things that have happened up until yesterday, your time. So I will hopefully be with you by the time the question and answer time comes about, as long as nothing goes wrong with my return flight. And I will share my screen and take you through my presentation. So as you know, I'm here to talk about the issue of genetic discrimination and life insurance. And this is something that I've been working on for many years, and I'm finally feeling like we are making some policy progress on this issue, which is really exciting. But I wanted to take you back just for a moment before we talk about why discrimination is an issue and why we need to do something about it, to talk about why genetic testing is so important. For the people in this room, that might be really obvious, but sometimes it's important to think about the impact that we're having when we do genetic testing and the potential to not have that impact when people decide they don't want to have genetic testing for reasons that aren't really to do with their choice, but are to do with fears around finances and other considerations. So I have here just some of the most common medically actionable genetic conditions that exist that we can do genetic testing for. And medically actionable, of course, means there is something that we can do to prevent the disease or to treat it early if we know that there is a genetic predisposition. Now, these three conditions, hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, Lynch syndrome, and familial hypercholesterolemia or genetic high cholesterol, affect about 1 in 75 people in the population. And we haven't found anywhere near that. We estimate that we have found possibly about 10% of people in the Australian population who have one of these conditions. So obviously there is an enormous opportunity for public health and preventive medicine through testing people for just these three genetic conditions. And of course, there are enormous other numbers of applications through genetic testing in terms of diagnosing disease, guiding treatment, and making other decisions around disease treatment as well. In the DNA screen study, which is another study that I lead with Paul Lacars at Monash University, we are testing people for these three conditions. And we're doing a pilot study to basically show the cost effectiveness of offering this kind of genetic testing as a population screening study to the entire population. So as this first phase, we're testing 10,000 young people between 18 and 40. Many of them have no family history or no real reason to think that they might have one of these genetic changes. But of course, when we enroll them into the study and we give them the consent materials, we have to tell them about things like insurance implications. And we find many people at that point decide they don't want testing. And I included this email because it's one that kind of encapsulated the concerns that we hear about all the time. And it kind of looks like I told the person what to write, and I promise I didn't. But he wrote to us and said, in case you're documenting the reasons why people are opting not to participate, I thought I'd let you know my reason. I find it very troubling that insurance companies could use the results from DNA screening to discriminate their service towards you. This guy is 32, and he said, I would hate to be stuck with higher premiums for the rest of my life just because I got DNA screening and am now better informed about my health. So for this reason, he chose not to participate in the study, and he consented to me sharing this information and this email de-identified like I have here. So on to what the situation is with genetic discrimination in life insurance. I should start by saying that health insurance in Australia is not underwritten by risk, it's community rated. And that means that if you have a genetic test result that shows you're at risk, or you're a smoker, or your father died of a heart attack, your health insurance is not differently priced based on your risk, and a health insurer can't decline to cover you based on your potential risk. Everybody within age stratified bands gets the same level of cover for the same price. But genetic discrimination by life insurers is still legal in Australia. It has been banned or restricted in many other countries. Most recently in 2017, Canada introduced the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which bans the use of genetic results to discriminate in a number of different ways. So any entity is prohibited from discriminating, and that covers all types of insurance. Research shows that insurance discrimination fears deter people from having clinically indicated genetic testing and participating in genetic research. And that's something that we see over and over again. Many studies have documented this. We hear this anecdotally all the time from health professionals and researchers. And like I showed you, that email that we got from DNA Screen, we get emails like that all the time. We hear all the time from people that once they know about this, they don't want to have testing. To build public trust in genomics, especially as we expand out into the general population, consumer protection against discrimination is crucial, and it's becoming urgent. This is something we've known about for many years, that we've been working on and been concerned about for many years, and now we're on the cusp of really enhanced access to genetic testing, and we have to have consumer protections to go along with that. Bit of background, in 2018, there was a parliamentary joint committee on financial services into the financial services industry, and particularly into life insurance, who looked at this issue. We gave evidence to that inquiry, and they published a report with a whole chapter on genetics and insurance, on what's been done in other countries. They were very concerned about the deterrent effect that this has on people's decision whether to have testing or not. And they recommended an urgent ban on the practice, similar to the one that exists currently in the UK, and that the government maintain a watching brief to consider whether legislation was necessary in future. In 2019, the insurance industry did implement a partial self-regulated moratorium on this practice up to certain financial limits. So those limits are, if you're taking out death cover, you can get up to $500,000 of death cover, which, as you can imagine, that's less than the average mortgage now. And so that doesn't really cover off on most people's liabilities. For income protection, you can get $4,000 a month. So that's $48,000 a year, which again, it doesn't really cover most people's salary if they really are in strife. So we have come to the conclusion that this moratorium falls short of the recommendations that were made by the Parliamentary Committee and fails to adequately protect consumers. We were concerned, although this was a good step by the insurance industry towards consumer protection, we were concerned that it wasn't adequate and that it wasn't going to resolve these issues that we saw with deterrence and with people not wanting to have genetic testing or participate in research. And so in 2020, we were funded by the Medical Research Futures Fund and the Australian government to monitor the effectiveness of the moratorium. And we have been conducting this research for the past 3 years, and we call it the A-GLIMMER project. And you can see there how we came to that acronym. And we did research with a number of different groups, with genetic health professionals, with patients, consumers, with researchers, and also with financial advisors who are in the industry. And I'm going to take you through the main findings of that study. It ended on the 30th of June, and we have published a final report, which I'll include the link to in a little bit. But the main findings we found, firstly, were around industry self-regulation and the inadequacy of that for consumer protection. We found that key stakeholder groups were very concerned about the life insurance industry's self-regulation of the moratorium and expressed a very low level of confidence in the effectiveness of the moratorium. There was a real issue with trust and a real idea that if this was regulated by industry, that was very much something people weren't going to trust, even if there were rules in place about how they would use information. An overwhelming majority of stakeholders, as well as many financial advisors that we interviewed, were also concerned about the fact that the Australian government has no oversight over the FSC moratorium. So there's no oversight over how they are complying with the moratorium, what the terms are, whether it has to remain in place or whether it's removed in future, which obviously creates issues for certainty. Another main finding was that legislation is required in Australia on this issue. So a very high proportion of our key stakeholders considered that legislation is required, and put there the percentages of the different groups who said this, and it's even higher than it seems. In each of those groups, the balance of those percentages isn't people who said no. There were some people that said they weren't sure or they weren't really certain. And in each group, it was a very small fraction who actually said no, legislation isn't something that should be implemented in Australia. We also found there were some issues around compliance and enforcement. We found instances were reported of non-compliance with the moratorium, including where insurance companies had asked applicants about genetic testing, even where that was contrary to the moratorium. So where the amount of cover that they were taking out was below the limits, they had asked about genetic testing, and instances where insurance companies had found ways to avoid offering cover, even where there were no other reasons to do that, where they had genetic test results, even when they were under the limits of the FSC moratorium. I've actually I've had a reach out from ASIC to ask some more details about this after we've published the report. And so it's great to see that they're taking some of these things seriously. We also found that there was a lack of effective mechanisms to enforce the moratorium or for people to seek redress. So where people said, even with the moratorium in place, I feel like I'm not being treated fairly, I feel like the insurer isn't doing what they're meant to under the moratorium, We found people didn't know where to go, and in fact, there really aren't many avenues to take other than bringing legal action or taking a significant action in the federal court. We also found issues around uncertainty and around the financial limits that are in place with the moratorium. We found stakeholders were concerned about the inherent uncertainty of the industry-led moratorium and the potential for them to use genetic test results in the future. So obviously, anything that's industry-led and industry-regulated can be changed or removed at any time. And this made people concerned that even if something was in place now, you can't put a genetic test back in the box. So once you know your genetic information, that's it. It's not going to change. And if the industry decided to remove that protection or change it in the future, that people would be stuck then saying, well, I didn't take out insurance yet, and now I have this test result, and there's nothing I can do about that. Similarly, there was a very broad view that the financial limits that are in place were too low to enable individuals to obtain sufficient life insurance. So there were some suggestions around, well, should we just increase that limit? You know, what if that limit was $1 million? And there are some really big concerns around just keeping a self-regulated solution that has a higher financial limit. One of those is that the deterrence still exists. People still don't trust the insurers to use the information in the way they should. There's still uncertainty around what might change in the future, and just increasing that limit a little bit doesn't remove all of those issues and concerns. And ultimately, we heard from people that that wouldn't remove the deterrence that they felt around not wanting to have this information without proper protections in place. We also found evidence that this issue was a barrier to research and that there was low awareness within many stakeholder groups around this. So many genomic researchers reported that the potential use of genomic test results was a barrier to the recruitment of research participants, and many said that they had had participants reach out to them, much like my participant in DNA Screen, and say that they would either ask questions about that insurance implication or say that they didn't want to be part of the research because of that. We also found there's poor awareness and knowledge about the moratorium among many of the stakeholder groups, including different understandings of how the limits should be applied, even among financial advisors. So, you know, amongst all of the different stakeholder groups, you would hope that financial advisors would have the best understanding of how these kind of things would be applied. But we found even among those groups, they disagreed around how some of these terms would work, how the limits would be applied, and what impact that would have on applications. And so for genetic counsellors and genetic professionals who are left having to explain this to people in a genetic consultation, it was even harder to imagine that they would be across that and be in a position to be able to give people the information that they needed, which is another reason that we need to remove this from that part of the conversation so people aren't making decisions in a genetic testing appointment about their financial future, but about their health future. So as I mentioned, the final stakeholder report was put out on the 30th of June, and it's available at this link. I'm happy to share these slides as well with anyone who wants to have them. But also, if you whip out your phone super fast, you'll be able to get that QR code and access that final stakeholder report. It contains a summary of all the research that we've done so far. Most of it is published. There are still a few papers that are making their way through the publication process, and it also contains a summary of the issues and our recommendations to government. We had quite a bit of media came out around that time. ABC ran a few stories, and also some stories of people who have been discriminated against, and also people who have chosen not to have genetic testing because of what they've seen in their family, and the fact that they don't want to go down that same path and they don't want to put themselves and their financial future at the same risk. And so they've chosen not to have testing for that reason. We made two main recommendations to government, and this was the primary one. We recommended that the Australian government amend legislation to prohibit insurers from using genetic results to discriminate between applicants. And the amendment we've suggested is to amend the Disability Discrimination Act. That act already prohibits the use of genetic results in generally. So it prohibits discrimination by using genetic results. But there's a carve out for insurers who are allowed to discriminate in ways that other entities aren't allowed to. And so an amendment to that act would remove that. We also made a recommendation that they consider amendments to financial services regulations to introduce a positive duty on insurers not to discriminate. And this is really to strengthen this regulation, to make sure that it's not just something in the Act that people can rely on if they have been discriminated against, but also as part of financial services regulation, there is an obligation and duty on insurers to not discriminate that's also included. We also made a second recommendation around allocating responsibility and resources to the Human Rights Commission to enforce, promote, educate and support individuals and relevant stakeholders to understand and meet the new legal obligations under the Act. So, of course, because the Disability Discrimination Act is part of the framework that the Human Rights Commission it does have responsibility for, this is already something that would come under their jurisdiction, but we wanted to make sure that the government was cognizant of the fact that there would be some resources required to make sure that people knew about this change and that they were able to be supported in any enforcement activity that needed to be taken. So what role can you play? We are getting forwards with our work that we're doing in this space, but there is a role to be played by everybody on this call and everybody in Australia. As I've mentioned, the project findings show that from the perspective of many of the Australian stakeholder groups, the FSC moratorium is not an adequate long-term regulatory solution to genetic discrimination. That fears of this continue to deter patients from having genetic testing, which is compromising the potential for genomic medicine. And we say Australia must now consider legislative amendments to address genetic discrimination. Now is the time for political engagement. And I'll tell you about what we've been doing. We've been working very hard with government and across the parties to try to gain support for these legislative changes. But everybody now has the opportunity to add their support to these recommendations and to ask their local member, their MPs, their senators to add support to this as well. In July 2023, a few months ago, just after our report came out, we had a roundtable with Stephen Jones, who's the Financial Services Minister and Assistant Treasurer. His portfolio has the primary responsibility for regulating financial services and the insurance industry. We also have been working with the Health Department and the Health Minister and also the Attorney General's Department, who also have roles around this, but Treasury and Stephen Jones have taken primary responsibility for looking at these policy issues and what the policy response might be. That was hosted by Josh Burns, who is my local member and is the chair of the Human Rights Committee. He's been incredibly supportive of this issue, and he actually introduced a motion about this issue in Parliament on the 4th of September. So that was just a few days ago, and it was spoken to by 5 other MPs across Parliament, both independents, Liberal National Party, Labor, and I've got here the pictures of all the people who spoke to this motion, and all of these MPs were incredibly supportive. There is a growing body of support within Parliament that we really need a legislative solution to this and that we need a change and that it needs to be done now. We also have Jed Carney, who's the Assistant Health Minister, who will be speaking on this issue on the 7th of September. So I actually believe by the time we're on this call, it will have just happened, but that's awesome as well. Jed has been very supportive on this issue and hopefully will also push forward some of the parliamentary issues on this as well. Finally, if you do want to get on board and support this, now is a great time to do that. We have an MP campaign. Again, we have the link there, and if you get your phone out, you can access that QR code to go to the page for that campaign. This is really just a way for people to easily look up and find their local MP and shoot off an email to them to ask them to support this legislative change. I've met with many MPs, haven't met with everybody yet. They are slowly becoming aware of this issue, but they are all very concerned about how their constituents feel about this issue and how it affects their constituents. So if you are someone that's concerned about this, you can go to this link there's a template email there, but you can insert there what your particular concerns are, if you have any thoughts, and then send that off to your MP. This does make a big difference. We have many people very closely watching how many of these emails are sent, and reading very closely what is being said in these emails and what people's concerns are. And so this is a very practical step that you can take and know that it will make a big difference. Thank you so much for being here. As I said, I'm hoping that I'll be on the call at this point and I'll be able to answer any questions you have. I'd love to have a bit of a discussion, and really grateful to you for your interest and your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane of yesterday, and thank you so much to Jane today, and thank you so much to technology, because I think that worked okay, and that's something I'm incredibly relieved about. So there's lots to pick up on here, and I'm sure all of you are ruminating on potential questions for Jane as well. We also have today with us Professor Martin Delatycki, and if you had a look at the slide of the meeting, Martin was standing there at the back. And so Martin's not going to give a formal presentation, but is going to share with us some of his observations as a clinician in the field, and the way that the question around discrimination for personally risk-rated insurance products is impacting him and the people that he works with, including his patients. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Ainsley. So, yes, I'm going to give you some random anecdotes and thoughts. They said I could talk about whatever I wanted to talk about, and so I'll spend the next hour describing why I think Carlton will beat Sydney tomorrow night at the MCG. But no, I won't do that. But Carlton supporters are very excited to be back in the finals. So, you know, I think to start with, that I have, you know, been in this space since really the late 1990s, and back then the company, or the organization that was the sort of peak body was called EFSA. And there was a lot of discussions with EFSA about genetic testing and insurance. And one of my favorite hobbies has been to write to insurance companies to point out when people are breaking their own rules. And I think that, you know, this is the first point, is that you can have all the rules in the world, but if the people underwriting the insurance and the brokers don't know about it, they will give people wrong advice. And I've certainly seen that several times. When we set up our first hemochromatosis screening study, which was called HemeScreen, this was highlighted as a major problem with doing screening for a genetic condition, that we were going to ruin people's insurability. And so we went to IFSA and we said, well, you know, if you've got the genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis, C282Y homozygosity in the HFE gene, and you have normal iron levels, you're actually not at risk of disease at all. And so they said, well, for your project, we'll give a guarantee that we won't discriminate if people are in that setting, so that if they have no evidence of organ damage and normal iron levels, then they get normal insurance. And then we went back to them and said, well, why is it just for a project? It should be for everyone. They said, yep, it's for everyone. And the other one that I talked to them about was for carrier screening. So we've had some concerns with people having, you know, and I'm talking here about reproductive carrier screening for recessive and X-linked conditions. And they put in writing that will not be asked for. And you can see that I get little bits of pleasure along the way. So one of my little pleasures was when I was doing my own income protection insurance, and they said, have you had a genetic test? And I said, yes, I've had Tay-Sachs screening. And they said, what was the result? And I said, I'm not telling you. And so that gave me, I hope they didn't discriminate against me and give me a higher premium on that basis. The next one to talk about is, you know, that many people on this call will have this experience of, you know, people come in saying, I've come to have my BRCA test. And so you talk to them about it and say this, and this. And if you've got the gene, you'll have this, and this done. And this is what we recommend. And by the way, you know, we need to tell you about insurance, that if you have the test and you have the gene or the mutation in the family, that it can impact new or upgraded life or life insurance products. And they say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And then they say, well, I'll do the test, and then while I'm waiting for the result, I'll go get it fixed up. And I say, well, you know, the problem there is that they're sneaky, and they say, have you had or are you planning a genetic test? So it's better to get that sorted first. And they say, okay, I'll go and do that. And then we never see them again. And that, you know, to me is immoral and heartbreaking. And then there are the people we don't see at all. So how many people just never come forward for testing because they've heard about this issue and just say it's better for me to get my insurance and never get tested. And, you know, there are people who are at 50% risk of a Lynch syndrome mutation, who are having regular colonoscopies because they don't want to have the genetic test. And that's not a good use of the health dollar if they're gene negative. And B, it's, you know, there's occasional very severe complications from tests like that, you know, that make it a great pity. And the other group that Jane has found several people in this category, and therefore if Jane has found several people, there are therefore hundreds of people and maybe thousands of people out there who have gone to an insurance company and said, this is my situation, and they've said, you can't have insurance, or given completely wrong advice, and they've just accepted it and have no idea that in fact they've been given wrong advice and could have insurance under some circumstances. Another anecdote is that I was at a party one night and I met a person, and what do you do? What do you do? I'm a geneticist. What do you do? I'm a lawyer. And they said, it's very interesting that you're a geneticist. I'm at 50% risk of BRCA, but I'm not having testing because of insurance. And, you know, we talked further and further, and they said, well, you know, it's health insurance I'm worried about. And I said, well, it doesn't affect health insurance. And the person said, well, it doesn't now, but it might in the future, and I'm not prepared to take that risk. And, you know, this is someone who's very well informed and very intelligent, and that's the thought process, and again, is, in my view, unacceptable. When we went to Josh Burns' office, there was a gentleman that was in that picture who has not had genetic testing because of it, and he talked about the fact that he has insurance and he pays the same as everyone else for insurance, but he's not covered for cancer at all. So there's two aspects to that that really got me thinking. One is that he made an incredibly good point, that why should he be charged the same as everyone else? But I looked it up just now, 1/3 of deaths approximately is cancer related, and he's getting covered for 1/3 less than everyone else, and he's paying the same. So that's one issue that needs to be thought about. The second one, though, is that a lot of people, you know, have a Lynch syndrome mutation, for example, and they say, well, we just won't cover you for any cancer. But as we all know, it's not every cancer that's at increased risk in any particular syndrome, and therefore that's another fact of poor use of facts and just wanting to just say, well, it's easier just to exclude all cancer rather than the cancers that are related to their syndrome. And my final comment is that I will be dead, I assume, when this is a fact, but there are younger people on this call that I think will live to see this, and that is that, you know, at some point, polygenic risk scores are going to be real and accurate and useful. And the bad news is that every one of us will have polygenic risk scores that mean we're at higher risk of something. We might be at lower risk of one thing, but we'll be at higher of another. So it's going to be ultimately pointless, because everyone will have increased risk of something. So the insurance industry will either have to come to terms with that, or will need to just suck it up and not include genetic testing. So I'm going to finish there and say that the work that Jane and Paul has done is incredible, and to get the moratorium, is an amazing achievement. But you won't be surprised that I am extremely strongly of the view that there needs to be legislation. The insurance industry in Canada hasn't fallen apart. The insurance industry in the UK hasn't fallen apart. The world has continued to rotate, and the sun continues to rise in the morning in most places. And so hopefully this latest burst of activity will lead to legislation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Martin, for that. You said it was just a series of dot points, but actually it was a really nice and incredibly passionate summary of your perspective and how you've seen it have a very real impact in your work. So we're now going to have a discussion, and we've got lots of different folks here. We've got almost 70 people on the call, which is wonderful. And so because there's so many of us, it will be much easier for me if you could please use the raise hand function. You're also, if you feel less comfortable speaking, please feel free to type a question into the chat and we can handle them that way. And feel free to also share your own experiences here if you'd like to, whether that be as someone facilitating testing, someone experiencing testing themselves, or a different role. Say, for example, if you're here from an industry perspective, we'd love to get you involved in the discussion as well. So while you are waiting to get your thoughts together, I've got a few questions that I've prepared. One I was going to ask you about, we gave Martin and Jane a list of questions in advance, but actually your talks were so comprehensive. I think we've covered off most, if not all of those questions. But I did want to pick up on the question of health insurance, and I guess bringing into that the anecdote from the lawyer at the party, Martin, but also I think probably in the experiences in the A-GLIMMER project around potential, I guess, confusion amongst stakeholders about the current scenario. And also, I guess, how health insurance came out going forward, because we know that private health insurers, I think, are interested in this information in the future. And so I guess, sorry, that's probably three questions in one, but I'll try and be clearer. I guess one is, do you think there is a bit of confusion perpetuating about health insurance among consumers that is making the situation worse? The second one is, do you think we should be planning now for possible health insurance interest in this information? Third, I guess, is, do we know anything yet? In your project, did you find out anything about health insurance? I'll let you two find out who gets to answer those in which order.
I will definitely start, but very happy for Martin to add his 2 cents as well. So we do spend a lot of time kind of trying to make that distinction clear and trying to remind people that health insurance is community rated, it is not risk rated, and therefore, it won't impact your ability to get health insurance, it won't impact the cost of your premium. It is certainly something that people have to be told about. As soon as you say insurance, people think health insurance, and I think it does contribute to the concern. However, when we clarify and then we say it's life insurance, it's not like they then say, well, in that case, I don't care, But an interesting thing, which I don't usually include in the summary just because there's a lot to go over, but it lends to the concern that we have about not paying attention to this issue now, is that we're starting to see, as you said, health insurers interested in this information. And the way that health insurers can use this information is that if you have a pre-existing condition, a health insurer can apply a 1-year waiting period on any cover related to that condition. And we actually recently have had a case of a woman who had a BRCA mutation, and she went to have her oophorectomy, so having her ovaries and fallopian tubes removed to decrease her chance of ovarian cancer, and the health insurer declined to cover her for that surgery on the basis that having a BRCA1 mutation is a pre-existing condition. Now, we did quite a lot of work around that, and there's a lot of concern within the community broadly and the genetics community around this idea that people will be further deterred if we have to tell them, oh, by the way, you know, you might have to wait if you don't already have health insurance. And we had some pro bono representation, and we've got some advice around that. But we are starting to see that kind of thing where even when a health insurer can't use the information to decline your cover, they are using what they can in terms of definitions to say, well, we're going to call a pre-existing, or we're going to call a genetic change a pre-existing condition, and then we're going to, you know, decline what we can, which when you think about it, if after the day after her 12 months expires, if she gets cancer, they're going to be on the hook for all of the costs of cancer treatment. But they still tooth and nail fight against paying for the preventive care within that 12 months, which is another issue altogether. But so there are other issues coming up that we're kind of got this central focus around trying to get legislation on life insurance, and then we've got other issues coming up around health insurance and how that information is perceived and used.
Thank you, Jane. Martin, do you have anything to add on top of that?
No, Jane has eruditely described it beautifully.
Great, thank you. I can't see any other questions as yet, so I'll keep going with my list. I was wondering, I know that you, in particular you, Jane, but probably all of you have attempted to engage and have engaged with industry, both before and during this project. So what is industry saying here? What is their response to the claims that you're making, and how in turn are you responding to the rebuttal that they're providing?
That's a long answer. So we have engaged with industry, and it's interesting because at the moment there's actually some flux in the insurance industry. The FSC is, you know, has been the holder of life insurance regulation and has been industry body for many years since IFSA became FSC, and they hold the code of practice, and the moratorium is now part of the code of practice, but that is still self-regulated. So the code of practice isn't registered with ASIC, for those of you that know what that means. And so the FSC still hold the code of practice, but the life insurance companies themselves have come out of the FSC and have built a new body called the Council of Australian Life Insurers, CALI, and CALI now sort of is considered the industry body. It's brand new, it has a CEO, but they don't yet hold the code of practice. There's a lot of confusion around who actually regulates life insurers at the moment, what the future will be of the code, including the moratorium. And so we have met with both FSC and CALI. CALI have been pretty clear that they don't support legislation. I am, of course, open to them changing their mind on that, but they feel pretty strongly that self-regulation can still work. We're of the view that they've had many years, not CALI, but the same companies that now form CALI have had many years to make a self-regulated solution work, and they haven't done so. The FSC, we understand, have been having some discussions because they still hold the code around that, and we're not sure exactly what position they are going to put. But I think there is certainly an argument for insurance industry supporting this, but we haven't seen that support yet.
Jane, Tiffany Bortwood, you've raised your hand. Hi.
Thanks, Ainsley, and thanks, Martin and Jane. That was really excellent presentations. Jane, a question for you. I should probably know this already. FSC, CALI, where does the Prudential Regulation Authority, APRA, come in that context? Because aren't they a regulator of life and health insurers as well?
APRA is sort of a overarching regulator, as is ASIC. So they have regulatory roles around industry, and depending on what the regulatory concern is, it might be an APRA concern or an ASIC concern. APRA don't have direct engagement or involvement with, for example, the moratorium or compliance with the moratorium, or directly around someone saying, I've had something happen and I got discriminated against. But APRA will have oversight of certain aspects of the whole industry regulation. Similarly, ASIC has some role in that. A code can be registered with ASIC, and when it's registered with ASIC, that gives ASIC more oversight over how a code is enforced. And there were some questions, and when we met with Stephen Jones, we sort of had some discussions around whether or not that would be a good path to take, like a kind of a better regulated code with some ASIC oversight. And I strongly believe that's not a good way to go. And the reason for that is that ASIC isn't meant to be an individual consumer protection body. It's not meant to be a body where an individual who's discriminated against has recourse.
It's not an ombudsman, sort of.
No, it's not. And if enough people brought something and it was seen that there were hundreds and hundreds of people being discriminated against, or it became a systemic issue, ASIC absolutely would look at it. Like I said, they reached out to me when they read the report, but they're not there for individual consumers. They're there for overarching breaches of the code. They're there for overarching issues. And so if you want to actually protect consumers, then you need to have consumer protection, which is what the Disability Discrimination Act is for.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tiff. And I'm just going to say, acronym city, like far out. We need a sort of hierarchy diagram and a little dictionary to help us. I'm also wondering, actually, there's a question from Ella in the chat. And also I'll just draw your attention to a comment from Wendy Bonathan at Bond University. And Wendy has said to me that she doesn't need to elaborate on it. It's just drawing out that health insurance companies have historically also been interested here, particularly with respect to partnering with companies that offer direct-to-consumer testing. So that's something else to watch out for. So Ella, would you like to unmute and elaborate on your comment, or would you like me to read it out?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, since the release of the paper, have you heard any response from the FSC or any other insurance representatives, like regarding your findings, and especially like the lack of compliance and enforcement and all those problems that you really found and highlighted?
So we have had engagement with the FSC. We had some partnering with the FSC around sharing of data. Of course, that was a somewhat tenuous relationship because our interests did not coincide particularly well, given that they are supportive of self-regulation and we are, documenting concerns with that. But certainly we did have some engagement with them. They haven't really responded to the particular issues we had, other than a few very specific ones that they said they'd gone back to insurers and raised it with them. Cali were interested as well in knowing about those instances. Of course, all of the research that we conducted pretty much related to things that happened when Cali did not exist. And so they were basically saying, we'd like to know what happened, but understanding that we weren't the body at that time, FSC was the body. And I'll respond to Amy's question just because I'm reading it there in the chat as well. For those who are not supportive of the ban, do you know what their reasons were? We did ask that question. And like I said in the talk, it was actually a very small number. There were some people that said, I'm not sure, or I don't know. Some people said, I'm not a politician. I don't really know what the best thing to do is. There were a few people who said legislation isn't required because I don't see that there's enough of an issue yet. There was this kind of, I need to be convinced that there's enough of a problem before we need legislation. Some people said, this is something that the insurance industry should be able to do themselves. A few people said, oh, well, don't they need this information to underwrite fairly? Questions like comments like that. But like I said, the fractions were around the 2, 3, 4% kind of fractions of people who said, no, we don't think that there should be legislation.
Thank you, Jane. Wendy, you have got your hand up now. Hi.
Sorry about that. I just lost my technology for a moment. Fabulous presentation. Jane, I have a question about how you'd actually go about reforming the legislation. Obviously, the moratorium and the insurance discrimination issue is one part of the puzzle, but we know there are other aspects where genetic discrimination is a live issue. Would you be more inclined to focus on perhaps reforming the Disability Discrimination Act to remove the exemption for life insurance? Or do you think reform should be embodied in a broader ranging genetic discrimination set of provisions?
Yeah, so we considered this, and as part of the journey that I've gone on with speaking to politicians and getting some support, we actually gave an update to the parliamentary committee who originally made the recommendations in 2018. In November last year, we met with them and they asked the question, how should this be done? And I prepared a memo that kind of looked at the different options. And one of those options was a standalone act. You know, there are some issues around privacy in genetics and privacy more broadly that need to be looked at in Australian law. And so there is scope, I think, to do some wider range reforms around genetic privacy and discrimination, et cetera. But what we said we recommended was that this is an issue that can be done in a very targeted way. Unlike Canada, we already have a discrimination act that includes genetic status under the grounds of discrimination with a carve out. And so rather than needing to draft a whole new act, it's possible to amend that existing act to remove that exception. And like I said in the presentation, that's the simplest thing to do. But what we've had significant discussions with Treasury and Stephen Jones' office about is making it the strongest regulation possible, which is to couple that amendment with a positive duty to not discriminate, which will need to be placed within a piece of financial services regulation. Now, the best place to put that is something that we're having discussions about, which Treasury is looking into at the moment, and we're not clear yet on where that might be, but it might be something like the Insurance Contracts Act or the Courts Act, but some kind of positive duty that isn't just you know, something that people can go to the Disability Discrimination Act and say, I've now got recourse, but that it's part of the obligations of insurers in their own regulation.
Thanks, Jane. Just before we keep going, I just thought I'd check in with Martin and see if there's anything else at this stage that you want to jump in and add to or clarify.
No, Jane,
Yeah,
Jane is the expert.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So that's good. I just want to make sure you get enough opportunity as well. So that's great. Thank you.
I won't be shy to speak up, don't worry.
Okay, good. Well, I'll stop being worried about you then. That's excellent. Thanks, Martin. There's another comment in the chat from Bonnie, and Bonnie is asking, Bonnie, I'll invite you to unmute if you'd like to, but otherwise we can read out your question.
Sure, thank you. I was just building on Amy's comment about, for those that were not supportive of the moratorium or insurance ban, do you know what their reasons are? And it made me think about, like, who are they and are they organised or not? They might not be organised at all. And what are the sort of key messages you hear, whether it be through like individuals and misperceptions and myths, or whether it's through like an organised strategic lobby? Thanks.
I wouldn't say they're organised, but certainly there are similar themes that come through. And I wouldn't describe it quite as devil's advocate, but I think often there's this idea that, oh, we have to be fair, and I think because as a culture in Australia, insurers have always had access to this information, we've come to expect that that is the norm and that that's the only way that insurance can operate. And I think that's what comes through in a lot of these responses. When I speak in Europe about this issue and I talk about the fact that this is still allowed, people are shocked and they say, I can't believe that Australia still allows this. I can't believe that, you know, this isn't something anyone's concerned about. And I often say, I'd like to pick you up and put you in front of the Australian government and say, this is how you are viewed in other parts of the world. But insurers have historically always had access to this. It's always been accepted that they have to have access to this to price risk fairly. They make a lot of noise about what will happen if they're not allowed to have this information. as they have in every country where this has been raised. And the point that Martin made well is that those fears don't eventuate. We haven't seen insurance industries kind of fall over in countries where they've banned this. But often there's this notion that because they've always had it and we've been brought up with that, and government has been very reluctant to regulate. We've had liberal governments that are much more hands-off in terms of regulation. It's an expectation. So I think people think that they're being fair-minded by saying, well, isn't this something that insurers need to have? And that's my understanding.
Thanks, Jane. I have another question, which is probably something you've had a bit along the way, and it's the question of genetic exceptionalism and how this can and should play out. Now, this is obviously a multi-layered debate that doesn't pertain just to insurance. And I guess there's two things here. One is, why is it that we're making these distinctions about genetic information, and how do we defend that? What is our basis for that? And then I guess the kind of flip side to that question is genetic information actually the canary in the coal mine here about health information more generally? And because, other types of health information can be predictive too. And we know people routinely are declined insurance or have their premium usually raised. Can't imagine it would be lowered because of various kinds of health conditions, including things that may only manifest in the future. So, I guess, is this actually an indication for wider reform? And the flip side is the first part of my question, which is, how do we defend a potentially exceptionalist stance here?
Yeah, so this does come up a lot. And I have to say, I know this isn't popular, but I've got lots of unpopular opinions. I have no problem with being a genetic exceptionalist, and I will gladly own that. I think a lot of people are, but it's come to be a term that's a bit derogatory, and so people don't want to claim it. Genetic information is absolutely different to other types of health information. It's absolutely different to other types of information, and it absolutely has different consequences. Being a smoker or not being a smoker is very different. It's a choice someone makes, and you might have a philosophical view about whether we should discriminate on the basis of that, but your genetics are there from birth and can't be changed at the moment, putting aside the potential of gene therapies. So I think I have no problem with separating out genetic information from other information. But the second thing, which I think is much more relevant when we talk about things like consumer protection, are that the reasons aren't just because it's different to other information, but it's around what the health impact and outcomes are and the deterrent effect. So if your father dies of heart disease, an insurer is allowed to ask that information, and they're allowed to discriminate by using that information. We know that. We know that we can't fix or we can't change all discrimination, because no one is suggesting that they will community rate life insurance completely. But the difference there is you're not making a decision about your health and choosing whether or not to have a test by someone using your family history. It exists. It might be a stand-in for genetics in some way. And so people often will say, well, what's the difference? They're going to use family history anyway. But the difference is genetic testing is the point where someone can choose, I will find out this information that I can act on, or I will not find out this information. And that will have significant implications for my health. And that deterrence is really important to remove. And so genetic information is one of those areas where if we say, well, it's just like everything else, and therefore we can't give it special protection, we don't remove that deterrent effect. And it does have different implications than any other type of health information because of that point at which you have to choose to have a test or not.
Great, thanks, Jane. Something else I was wondering about is, you talked a little bit about Canada and the fact Martin mentioned, I think, that the risk-rated insurance industry has continued there. 1,000 years ago, when I was a PhD student, I went to an then IFSA event, and I can still remember the person from IFSA saying Australia's industry is too small for that. It won't sustain. It'll only take like one family to overload based on the knowledge they have and we don't, and the whole industry will fall over. And I was like, oh, okay. You know, I was very junior, didn't really feel like I could respond to that, didn't have the knowledge to allow me to respond to that. So, I mean, how does the size of Australia's population or the industry, or even indeed, I guess, our regulatory structures, you know, does it enable those comparisons to be made with places like the UK and Canada? And actually, is there anything to that claim about the size of our insurance industry? I think I know what your answer will be, but I'd like to hear it anyway.
I'm gonna jump in and have a word on that. It's clearly absurd because everything's ratios. So in here, if X% are at risk of a genetic condition, it's the same percent that are in a bigger country. And Canada, the population is not that different to Australia, is my immediate thought. Over to you, Jane.
Yes, good points. Canada is very similar to Australia in a number of ways. Having a publicly funded health system, the size of the population. One thing which makes it slightly different is that we have strong superannuation here. And of course, some people have life cover through their super. Life cover that you can get through your super without having any underwriting is usually a very small amount. So the default cover that people have is small, and people who want to get bigger amounts are either getting a retail cover or they're getting an expanded cover through their superannuation, which when you get to that level requires underwriting anyway. So it has less of an impact than people like to think. But we do have a similar size population and a similar kind of type of society than Canada has. And before they introduced the legislation in Canada, the Privacy Commissioner commissioned several reports from an economist and from an actuarial specialist who works on genetics and insurance to say what will be the impact on the Canadian insurance industry if we introduce this complete ban across all types of insurance, health insurance, life insurance, and all industry. And both of those reports, which you can read online, came back and said the impact on industry would be minimal in the short term. And in Canada, they said, you know, they welcomed that piece of legislation. Now, the argument is made that as we expand out testing to the broader population and we're testing everybody, this problem will become bigger and bigger. But the problem with that argument is that as you expand testing out to the whole population, you just end up with the insurance pool. So if you're insuring 1,000 people and 2% of them have one of these conditions and they're not getting tested, they still have it and they're still in the pool getting regular levels of insurance. If they get tested, they're more likely to take preventive measures. They're less likely to die, but they're less likely to be able to get insurance. And so actually, it makes less sense as you expand out into the population rather than more sense.
Can I just make one other point? That the life insurance you have with super, this is nothing to do with any of this, but I could save a lot of you a lot of money. I discovered, unfortunately, quite recently, you pay for that and it's voluntary. So I discovered I was paying $500 a month for life insurance that I didn't want. And that's $6,000 a year. So I've stopped paying that and it's going into my super instead of to my kids when I die. Hopefully that won't happen. So if you don't want to be paying it, stop paying it. See, you get financial advice.
Yeah, financial advice and intellectual content about genetics and insurance. Thank you. We have a question from Nick Pachter. Hi, Nick.
Hi all. Hi, Jane and Martin. Thank you. Very interesting. Martin, yeah, you might win against Sydney, but I think it'll end after that. Actually, Jane just touched on a point that I wanted to I just had a bit of a reflection or think about, but I just want to make a comment. The feedback that we've been getting in, certainly for our patients in relation to the moratorium, is that, yeah, the insurance companies just bypass that by going on family history. So family history counts against you, and therefore the moratorium has been that effective from that purpose. So something I've long thought about, and I guess Jane just raised this, is can we not tackle this point that if a person has a genetic test and it indeed will actually improve their health outcome, can we not influence the insurers to change the way they view the risk? Because at the moment, it's presumably it's tables and numbers based on risk where there is no intervention. But as soon as we introduce genetic testing status and intervention, that presumably will improve their risk and improve their ability to get insurance. So we could turn this around to genetic testing actually improving their insurance situation from where they're at.
And it's an excellent point, but it's another example of why the regulation that we have at the moment is inadequate, because actually under the Act right now, if an insurer doesn't take into account the preventive measures you're taking or the ways that you're improving your risk, they're actually in breach of the legislation that exists already. But we know that's not always happening. And people don't trust them to do the right thing, and they're not seeing them doing the right thing. And there's very little recourse for, what do we do now if they're not doing the right thing? Bringing a case is very difficult. Finding someone to be a plaintiff is very difficult, but they should be doing that now. And so it's interesting when Martin talked about speaking with IFSA and getting the exception for hemochromatosis. And of course, it was great to get that in writing, but they should have been doing that already. Not doing that was clearly breaching the Act already. And so for them to say, oh, well, just for you, we'll do this for your research project, that's their requirement under the Act anyway. And that's within the small protection that we already have, which isn't really being done very well.
Now you tell me, I was so proud of that.
Well, it's excellent to have that because it gives people certainty and it puts it on paper and, it puts policy, it puts things in place for them. But it's no concession by them. It's their requirement already.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Nick, for the question, and Martin. Bonnie has just popped another point in the chat around actually one of the benefits of the inbuilt risk-rated insurance products in superannuation. And I would also count myself among those because I've been declined a risk-rated insurance, not for genetic reasons, but for other health stuff. So Bonnie, I'm wondering if you'd like to just expand a little bit on the point you've popped in the chat.
Sure, thank you. I feel like it's a very anecdotal comment that for me personally with the BRCA1 mutation, I found that going through my super companies, and I've done it twice now, to access insurance has been more beneficial because then my super company will advocate on behalf of me. And obviously if they have financial advisors they can tap into too, but it's just like an extra layer of people fighting for me in the process, which has been useful.
And that's nice to hear, I think, that a super company will do that as well. It doesn't, I don't know many of them, but it's not something you typically hear stated in the public domain. So thank you for sharing that.
I feel like it's a bit like Jane mentioned, where the super company has an interest in advocating on behalf of me because it would then translate to financial benefits for them too. So but anyway, I like to think they care on a deeper level as well.
Maybe it's both.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, we're at 1/4 the hour. We generally go for an hour and a half. Before I sort of formally close the seminar-based part of the proceedings, I'll just ask if there are any final questions or comments from attendees. It seems not. But there is so much to take away from this. We've got links to the A-GLIMMER report. We've got links to what can happen next. We've heard from people with lived experience. We've heard from healthcare providers and from ethical legal experts, including Jane, of course, but also Wendy. And so the final thing to do formally is to say a big thank you to both Jane and Martin, and indeed the entire A-GLIMMER team, for the project that you've done, which looks to have been a massive success. And so thank you for coming and presenting for us today.